All right, so in the first part of this lecture, we looked at some of the evolutionary thinking prior to Darwin, and we saw that even among the kind of creationists, they started to see creation as a progressive a series of events with extinctions in between to account for the fossil record. And there were already various people like Lamarck and Chambers advocating the idea of transmutation too, not just that there was change over time, but each new species was actually descended from, the previous species. So let's see what Darwin has to contribute to this. All right, so Darwin had his own sort of evolution, you might say, in his views. He initially was following this sort of progressive idea like Sedgwick, the series of catastrophes to sort of create the different geological features we see. But then during his voyage on the Beagle that I mentioned, long voyage, 5 years, traveling all around the world, including the Galapagos Islands most famously, he became a uniformitarian, having read Lyell's book. Right, and you remember he was also looking during the voyage to find these sort of centers of creation that Lyell postulated, that God sort of dropped animals at certain points on the earth where they were suited to thrive. Particularly in looking at the Galapagos and comparing the Galapagos species with the American, South American mainland, he gave up that view. And you kind of saw this argument in problem set 3, so I won't labor it too much, but here we have the Galapagos Islands, which as you see are kind of off the coast of Ecuador and so on, but quite far, a few hundred kilometers away. And similarly to the west of West Africa, you have the Cape Verde Islands. Okay. And as shown in these pictures, you can see that the islands themselves are pretty similar. They're volcanic, they're quite mountainous, and they have similar climate, similar soil, and so on. So if God was sort of looking for suitable spots and dropping down species where he thought they would flourish, you might expect him to put similar animals on these two sets of islands. But that's not what we see. The Galapagos species are similar to the American. Darwin said something like, standing anywhere in the Galapagos, even if you didn't know where you were in the world, other than from the plants and animals you see around you, you would just sort of know if you were a biologist, you were standing on American land. And similarly, the Cape Verde is unmistakably African. Okay. And the explanation, according to Darwin, is that these islands received colonists somehow. Maybe there was a land bridge. Maybe the oceans were lower at one time. Animals could walk across, or birds could fly, of course, and maybe other animals could drift along on rafts or something. Anyway, somehow the islands received colonists, and then once they got there, that's the other thing. They're not identical species. They're clearly American in the Galapagos, but they're actually not the same as any species on the mainland. So after they arrived, they must have evolved, they must have changed, transmuted into new species, but the same general kind as those on the near mainland. Right. So, I mean, I'm not going to read all this, but here we have all the arguments that I've just summarized from Darwin. So he says that this sort of data that he's got can receive no sort of explanation on Lyell's view of independent creation. But on his view, it's pretty much exactly what you would expect. So his view is confirmed, supported by this data. Yeah, and he argues in a way rather similar to Copernicus. And in fact, he refers to the way that people argue in physics, where if you see sort of a connection between facts, you don't just say, well, that's just how it happens to be. You try to find some explanation for it. You try to sort of reduce it to some more general principle. Just as, if you remember, when Copernicus found that all the planets in some way duplicated the solar orbit, either in their epicycle or the deferent, he didn't say, well, that's just, the way it is. These things just happen to be perfectly synchronized. He wanted to say there's a sort of deeper explanation, namely that we're attributing the Earth's motion to all these other planets because we're standing on the Earth. Darwin is offering a very similar type of argument here. Okay. The creationist just has to consider this brute fact, whereas the evolutionist can explain it. All right, so I would say, and I think everybody agrees, actually even the creationists today agree, we should note that the kind of creationism that Lyell advocated is not the only possible kind. In fact, I think Richard Owen, I think I mentioned, is another creationist contemporary of Darwin. He got kind of annoyed at The Origin of Species and gave it a rather negative review because he felt that Darwin was sort of straw-manning him, or at least only arguing against one specific kind of creationist, which didn't cover his view. All right. So yeah, creationists today would sort of agree with Darwin as to why the finches, for example, on the Galapagos are similar to the American ones, but not the same, that there was a certain amount of transmutation going on. The creationists today just tend to limit the amount of evolution that can occur to sort of fairly small details as opposed to wholly new structures. Okay. All right, so far, Darwin is arguing for a form of evolution that is not really different from Chambers, for example, or even Lamarck. What sets Darwin apart from these writers is the mechanism, not just the fact that organisms change gradually over time as you move from parent to offspring over thousands of generations, but the cause of that change. All right, so Darwin's mechanism is the principle of natural selection. Okay, so Darwin came up with this idea and was the first person, as far as we know, to do so. Although there are people that kind of vaguely suggested it earlier, but I'm not going to mention them. So Darwin actually discovered this idea of selection. He came up with it after reading Malthus, who's the guy that predicted that there would be these huge disasters as the human population, or actually, I mean, he would say any population, because if there's enough, as they grow, because if there's enough food for a population of animals of some kind, or plants even, then they'll grow exponentially. One becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, etc. But eventually you're going to kind of run out of space or run out of food, and then there's this huge crash, the Malthusian catastrophe, sometimes called. Okay, so Darwin figured that because even if there's plenty of food at first, the population is going to grow exponentially until the food starts to run out. Inevitably, there's competition between organisms of the same species. And, of course, there's also competition with other species. But even if we just focus on one species, there's competition. There's, in Darwin's phrase here, there's a struggle for existence, okay? You want to eat that plant, well, somebody else wants it too. You're going to have to compete with them. All right, so, and then he says, well, there's some variation in the population. Not everybody in this population is identical. And some are going to vary in a manner, as it says, profitable to itself. So some of them are going to have a slight leg up on their opponents, and have some slight advantage. Maybe they're a little bit taller or faster or have better sense of smell or something, or a better shaped beak for getting the seeds out of a certain plant that's plentiful this year. Okay, so they're going to have some kind of an edge, and then they have a slightly better chance of surviving, and thus, he says, be naturally selected. The environment, as it were, is going to pick and choose who wins from this population and goes on to reproduce and produce copies of themselves. And then, as he says, by the principle of inheritance, whatever trait that organism has that is selected, it's going to pass that trait on to its offspring. So then that trait is going to spread through the population. Okay, that sort of advantage is going to become just sort of the new norm in the population. Okay, so this is the principle of natural selection, and he says that over many generations, if you have selection operating and continual variation, then you can explain the changes we see in the fossil record, all the way from microbes to human beings. So this principle of natural selection is really the first serious alternative for sort of a naturalistic theory to the argument that Paley put forward, funnily enough, in 1802, the same date as Lamarck's theory of transmutation. Now, Paley, of course, was not the first person to, appeal to design to explain biological structure. We saw that going all the way back to Socrates, and you see it much earlier than that. Anyway, so Paley wrote, though, a very famous book, Natural Theology, in 1802, and it was very influential, including actually Darwin. Okay, so Darwin says here, I do not think I hardly ever admired a book more than Paley's Natural Theology. I could almost formally have said it by heart. Okay, so Darwin was very impacted by this book as well. And in the book, Paley starts with thinking about if you're just sort of wandering through the woods and you found a watch. Okay, I've got a picture of the inside of a watch here. So imagine you crack open this watch and that's what you see inside. And these things, he says, are obviously designed. They have function. Its purpose is to tell the time, and the parts of the watch are very finely adjusted, very finely crafted in order to fulfill that function, to carry out that function. Okay, and there doesn't seem to be any other way that a watch could come about. They don't sort of just form like snowflakes or like rocks or things like that by chemical or physical processes. So clearly they were designed. And he thinks the same reasoning applies to living organisms, where you also have obvious purposes, the different parts of the organism, like the eye and the heart and the muscles and so on. And they're also very finely engineered to carry out those purposes. Okay, so that's Paley's argument. I'm not going to read all this, but he compares the eye to the lenses of a telescope and so on, and he doesn't think there's any way you could explain that other than by appeal to some kind of engineer. Yeah, so that's the challenge of anyone who wants to explain the mechanism of evolution. It's not just how can you get change, but how can you get what looks like engineering, okay? And now, of course, we have microbiology, biochemistry, and so on. We know that there's a lot more engineering within living bodies than Darwin even knew. I mean, just think about those like motor proteins. You see the animations of this motor protein kind of within the cell. These it's like these what are they called? Microtubules within the cell that are like little railway lines. You've got these little walking molecules that are dragging bags of proteins or something, bags of little bits and pieces that need to be transported here and there. They're kind of walking around, and it's incredible. So how to explain all that kind of thing? No one had an explanation other than design until Darwin came along. You remember how ridiculous Lamarck's ideas were, that somehow it just happens by material processes. Everybody laughed at that. But here, it seems at least that stuff might actually be engineered by sort of trial and error, right? I mean, it doesn't seem possible that just random changes can produce anything. But if you have random changes that are then filtered by seeing whether they work or not, maybe that could work, right? It's not so obvious that it can't, at least. Yeah, so here's Huxley making this argument then against Paley, all right? So he's sort of cutting in after Paley has made his argument, and then continues, suppose that anyone had been able to show that the watch had not been made directly by any person. It's not been done by a watchmaker or an engineer. And he imagines like a series of small modifications that was made to an initial very simple system, which he says we can imagine is just a revolving barrel, just something that could come about fairly easily, maybe by chance. And so how did this series of changes happen? Well, let's say from some sort of natural tendency for the structure just to vary a little bit in any direction. But then also suppose there's something in the environment, there's something in the surrounding world which helped all variations in the direction of an accurate timekeeper. Let's suppose for some reason the more accurate watches were able to survive and reproduce themselves, whereas the inaccurate ones just sort of died out and disappeared. Well, he says then it's obvious that the force of Paley's argument would be gone. We then have another explanation, a purely natural explanation for how the watch came about. So this is the thing with Darwin. Okay, this is why Darwin is better known than Chambers or Lamarck or anyone else that's written on the topic. This is the key. All right. Now, if you actually look at how clocks and especially watches work, I don't know if it's sort of obvious at all. This is one of my sort of philosophical comments. You may gather that I'm a little skeptical of this explanation, as if you remember, Polanyi was, and a bunch of physicists actually. I'm not sure it's obvious that this story that Huxley is telling about a series of, contraptions that sort of head towards a functioning clock, starting with just some simple revolving barrel, where each version is just a very slight improvement on the previous one. I'm not sure if it really could happen because like these escapement mechanisms are pretty key. So if you imagine, you see in each case there's sort of a large toothed wheel, and you have to understand that that is being forced to turn by a spring that's tightly wound. So if that wheel were unrestrained, it would very quickly spin, rapidly, a few hundred times, a few thousand times, I don't know, but the spring would wind down in a matter of seconds, okay? But instead of that, you want that energy in the spring to be released slowly over, 4 or 5 days until you have to wind the clock or the watch up again. So to slow it down and also to have it turn at a constant speed so that it measures time evenly and accurately, you somehow got to have a mechanism that stops it from rotating very quickly, but just, ticks around slowly. And so I've got various escapement mechanisms here. The one on the left is the simplest from, looks like a grandfather clock. There's obviously a pendulum lower down that you can't see, a big weight on it. And you can see as it tips, it just allows the wheel to turn one tooth. It's a pretty clever mechanism, even though it's very simple. For a watch, though, you can't use this because watch is always getting turned upside down and everything. For a watch escapement, you need something like this more complicated mechanism on the right here. And the worry here is that it may be that to get, let's say, from this simple escapement mechanism to the more complex one, you can't get there in a series of small changes. It may be that any sequence necessarily has sort of big leaps in it in some places. Also, you can imagine if you just make tiny changes to this one, it's most likely to just jam and stop working, or you're going to lose contact between the sort of pincer that goes from side to side and the tooth wheel, and then it's just going to start spinning without restraint, and again it's going to stop working. So I'm not going to go on about this, but I just wanted to sort of plant, I suppose, a seed of skepticism as to whether the thing that Huxley is imagining really can be done. there's a difference between sort of vaguely imagining something happening versus it actually being possible. Okay. All right, now let's move on then to Wallace. Now we haven't left Darwin, but I just want to talk about some of the other people at the same time. So Wallace was also a believer in transmutation. And actually he was, even though the scientists generally trashed Chambers, Wallace thought there was obviously something right about what he was saying, despite the scientific mistakes. But, you know, remember, there was nothing in Chambers about the mechanism, or at least he certainly didn't have the mechanism of natural selection. But Wallace, actually, while he was, I think he was in Malaysia or somewhere, he was kind of an adventurer. He was a bit like Indiana Jones, the Indiana Jones of biology, sort of energetic and adventurous person who would basically make money by collecting specimens and send them back to London. While he was like delirious, I think, from malaria somewhere, maybe Malaysia, he sort of came up with the idea of natural selection in 1858. Now, this is long after Darwin did. I'm not sure exactly when Darwin came up with the idea, but at least a couple decades earlier, I'm pretty sure. So it was, Darwin had priority. But when, you know, Darwin kind of kept his idea quiet for a long time. So when Darwin got this letter from Wallace saying, I have this new idea about evolution, Darwin was like, wait, that's my idea. Okay, so Darwin had to quickly publish, although very generously. The first publication was a joint letter with Wallace. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, Darwin was a generous guy, because even after his Origin was published, he was referred to the theory of natural selection as Wallace's and my theory, something like that. Yeah, and so Darwin and Wallace remained on good terms, although they did have a bit of a falling out over another essay that Wallace wrote, where he criticized human evolution anyway. Oh yeah. So this was a paper in 1869 that thought that even though natural selection would explain a lot of the natural world, he didn't think it would explain the human mind. And actually, if you look at Wallace's book, I think it's called, I forget what it's called. You can get it online, actually. I was reading it, but he thought that various other things like feathers too might be a problem for natural selection, but certainly human evolution, he thought, must have been the action of an overruling intelligence. Yeah, and Darwin was not happy. He wrote, I hope you have not murdered too completely your own and my child, referring to the theory of natural selection. Yeah, now going back to Lyell, remember this geologist who was also a creationist. Darwin was really hoping to convince Lyell that he was right. He saw Hooker and Lyell and a few others as really key to sort of winning the battle of British science in favor of his theory. And he did largely convince Lyell, but not about human evolution. He went actually along with Wallace on that. So in the next section, I think it's coming up. Yeah, in the next section, I want to talk about generally people that supported Darwin and people who were critical, including religious people. So there was a mixed reaction among clerics. You might think, you know, looking at the landscape today of sort of particularly evangelical Christians that are opposed to evolution generally, that they would have all been against Darwin. But at that time, it was rather different. I mean, generally speaking, clerics didn't have any opposition to evolution as such, because they could imagine that evolution was guided by God. They didn't really have a problem with the millions of years or anything like that. Now, some were hostile to the Darwinian story as well. It seemed to be materialistic, okay, but not all. Some people were actually strongly supportive of Darwin and very enthusiastic about it. Yeah, and another thing that is worth knowing here is that Darwin suffered from poor health. through most of his life. And he didn't really have the temperament for public argument and debate. He didn't want to sort of argue toe-to-toe with various critics of his. So that role largely fell to Huxley, who was sometimes known as Darwin's bulldog, to defend the origin in these public debates, famously with Wilberforce, some kind of religious character. And Huxley was definitely hostile to religion. He was a self-described agnostic. That means he didn't believe in God. I mean, agnostic means that he didn't completely rule out God's existence, but he certainly didn't have a positive belief in God. And the other X-Club members, I mentioned the X-Club, I think, in a previous lecture, sort of group that promoted naturalism as a sort of philosophy behind science. So they were seen as the supporters of Darwinism, and they were the kind of the atheists, or the closest thing to atheists at that time. And so there's sort of this association between Darwinism and atheism that probably didn't make it easier for religious people to accept his theory. Okay, that'll do for this part.